This is Death or Prison, brought to you by leanonmeusa.org.
Hello and welcome to the Death or Prison podcast, brought to you by leanonmeusa.org. I am Johnny Branham, and to my right, Mr. Raul Lopez. And to my left, we have our guest today, Mr. Timothy Kane. 25 years in the Florida Department of Corrections. We're going to be talking about his story, or he's going to be telling you all his story. Timothy, I want to start out with, where were you born?
I was born just outside of Chicago, Illinois.
And what was life like growing up in Chicago? Because definitely Florida is a different type.
Well, we lived in the suburbs, and we moved to Florida by the time I turned about 7. So I have memories from up there, obviously the snow and stuff like that in the school system, but not takeaway memories of like that's home. I still have some nostalgic memories.
Age 7, you all moved from Chicago?
Yep.
And where do you all?
We landed in Hudson, Florida. My grandma lived there for decades before that, so my dad moved us down there to be closer to her.
So mom and dad.
Yep, as a family.
From Chicago to Florida, I know that there is a drastic change as far as temperature, as far as atmosphere. Do you make friends in the new neighborhood?
Yeah. Immediately, I made a lot of new friends, but we lived right off a canal. It was my dad's grandparents' old house that we were renting from my grandma that we were living in, and it was a canal right on the Gulf. So we always had beach access, always swimming, always running around. There was a lot of kids to be involved with. We shared a bus stop with a lot of kids, so you got to know a lot of people really quick.
Any siblings?
I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, an older brother, older sister, older brother, me, a younger brother, younger sister.
So, Tim, it sounds like a very happy childhood at that point.
It seemed normal. Yeah, definitely seemed normal at that point.
What was school like? Going to school, and where did you go to school?
So Hudson Elementary, I went to school there. Nothing notably different than any other kid going to school up to that point. My parents got separated when I was in 6th grade. We moved down here. I think I was in the 2nd grade when we moved down. My parents separated and later divorced when I was in 6th grade. And that's where things started getting a little more topsy-turvy. After my parents did divorce and they had 2 different places, I did find myself able to bounce between houses. If I wasn't liking what was going on with my one parent, my mother or my dad, whatever type of discipline, I could avoid it by just moving to mom's or moving to dad's. And I believe that kind of led me into being where I was this weekend. This happened, that I found myself going into the sense that I ended up walking into.
Tim, before we get there, a lot of times we just go over, well, my parents got divorced, but I know as a kid, especially at 10 years old, a lot of things probably happened emotionally. You said that's when things started to go bad. What were some of your thoughts, emotions? What were you going through at that age, at 10 years old? And I ask because a lot of the people in the audience, you'll find out that a lot of the problems stem from a divorce, a split marriage, a broken home.
I see a loss of structure. When my mom and dad were a unit, dinner was a constant, being like there was family things that everything kind of revolved around. But once my parents split, my mom was going to school at the time, working a job, so she was never really there. And then you find yourself parenting yourself. And as an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, that's not healthy. Or even I had a younger brother, younger sister that I would be in charge of, or if we were staying at my mother's house. And then in my dad, I noticed a lot more him trying to be friends instead of a father, trying to just pacify you for the little time he had you, instead of being, someone that can tell you no and you'd respect it because he was your dad, So that's where I began to see, for me, issues where I didn't feel necessary to be home. I'd find myself staying out with friends over the weekends, staying at a friend's house instead of wanting to be home because like I could run from that responsibility of having to be a babysitter or that kind of thing. I wasn't ready for that responsibility.
Were either of your parents into any faith? Was God in the picture at any household?
They both were raised they went to Catholic high schools in Chicago, and I know neither one of them gravitated towards church. Like Christmas was Santa Claus, Easter was the Easter Bunny. So that was not that they ever would say, if someone said Jesus, it wasn't like a curse word in our house. I don't want to say that, but it wasn't something that was taught, that, you know, there is a God who came to know us as a person, even, you know, and that this is the word of God, and something to respect. But it wasn't ever like that. No.
Were there any other adults in your life that you could look back and say, well, this person, whether it was coach or teacher or somebody that you could say this person was influential in my life?
There was a couple men I did look up to and respect. I had a couple friends whose dads were pastors of a church, and one, Daniel Holbrook, his dad Rusty was a coach for the PAL football team that we played on, and I'd stayed the night at their house before on a Saturday night and went to church with them on Sunday, and I did see him as sort of different, and I definitely recognized it after I got arrested with being involved in what I was involved in. He came to the juvenile detention center, and he was he was the first person besides my mother and father to actually see me. And looking back now, he since passed a couple years after that, but looking back now, I do recognize him as the first man of God who actually spoke things of God to me, you know, even in my situation, despite my situation.
You mentioned getting into some things.
Yeah.
Getting into trouble is and what age were you?
So by the time I was about 12, 13, I had a habit of staying out weekends with friends of mine. Now one of them is my co-defendant. I'd met him at the same bus stop when I was 7, 8, 9. He was the same age as my older brother. And Bobby Gardner, I met him there at the bus stop, and we lived in the same neighborhood. And he was one of the first ones in our neighborhood to get a gaming system. The Nintendo had just come out. So like it was nothing for me to drop everything after school and go over there and spend, you know, until mom and dad told me I had to come home, I wouldn't come home, you know, and I found myself more and more like that. So by the time I was 11 and 12, when my parents had split, I found myself staying over there a lot over the weekends, you know, because that was just it was a hideaway for me. And not that we were getting in trouble, but it wasn't. I look back and I know it's not healthy. It's not healthy for a kid to think he can do whatever he wants. And that's kind of how I felt being around when I was at Bobby's house.
So Bobby's parents were more lenient. There was no less supervision, and you guys were kind of allowed to have free reign.
Sort of. He's 3 years older than me again. So at this time he's 15, 16, and his mom was single. I think she began dating someone when this crime happened, but she was out a lot. She worked full time, and then she was out a lot. And so Bobby was left to, you know, do whatever he saw fit. He had dropped out of school a couple years before that. I still went to school, and living with my mother, I was like 10 or 12 miles away from where he lived. But the night this happened, I was spending the weekend at their house.
You're pointing to an event.
Yeah.
What is that?
So Super Bowl Sunday in 92, January 26th of 1992, I was spending the weekend at his house, and he had a couple other kids over, a 19-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 15-year-old, and I was 14. I had just turned 14. And we were watching the Super Bowl, playing video games. This is a normal type thing for me, but the 19-year-old convinced Bobby to break in a house with him. He wanted to steal some stuff. He needed some money to get his license. At least that's how he presented it. And he was going to do it tonight, you know, and he convinced Bobby to go. We're at Bobby's house, so we all go with him. He said he wanted to break in this specific house because they had satellite equipment and a big boat, and it was on the water. You know, like he picked this house intentionally. So I just thought I was tagging along. I didn't think I was going to get in any trouble. And lo and behold, he did break in the house. He did. The two of the kids, the 16 and 15-year-old, decided not to go in the house, but I ended up going in the house with Bobby and Alvin killed 2 people. So 2 people died that night there, and that's why I got charged with murder. I was in the act of a felony when someone died during the commission of the crime, and because they said I was a willing participant in going into a house, there was, you know, the letter of the law in the state of Florida is you're just as guilty as someone that actually pulled the trigger.
I'm not trying to get graphic or whatever, but a lot of people that are incarcerated right now can relate to a story like yours. You don't have to go into deep details, but tell us exactly. You said a person shot 2 people. What transpired? You could walk us through. You got to the house, breaking the door, going through a window.
He ended up breaking in a door, but there was some even before we went in the house, when the 16 and 15-year-old said that they weren't going to go in the house, there was a little drama that played out even then. And that's what kind of convinced me. I had nowhere to go. I live 12 miles away. It's already night. It was actually a cold night in Florida, January 26th of 92. And I couldn't think in my mind that I could make a 12-mile bike ride home. The other kid lived a street over, and the 16-year-old had said that, he just got in trouble. He can't do anything that would get him in trouble again because his parents would kill him. That was his exact words. And so with Alvin berating them, I felt kind of peer pressure. I felt the peer pressure of well, I don't even know what's going on really, but I'll go with him. I have nowhere else to go. Like, that's how I felt. So what I witnessed when he kicked in the door, he immediately started moving back toward the back of the house, and almost immediately after the door kicked open, I heard a man's voice say, "What's going on? Who's here? Who's out there?" And I immediately hid under a table. So that was my whole experience in this house, is that hiding under a table as he confronted a man who came out. It was a elderly man in his mid to late 50s. And then his mother, he came out, and she was in her late 70s. And he laid him down on the ground like it was going to be a robbery, and you could tell he was flustered. He didn't know what to do now that there's people involved, and they started dialoguing back and forth. So in this, as a witness to this, I don't know, it got quiet where Bobby and Alvin started conferring amongst each other, and I decided I can get out from under the table. I want to leave. So I crawl out from under the table, and I tell him, I want to go. And he said, no one's going anywhere, and the people were, his name was Mr. Bowers, John Bowers, was speaking to him and said, just take anything you want, just leave. We won't even call the police, just leave. He has a small sawed-off shotgun that he had on his handlebars that was wrapped in a towel. You couldn't even tell that there was anything on there until we got to this house. But he told him, you guys have already seen my face, and he said, no one's going anywhere. He's looking. I'm already overwhelmed, so I just backed away from him. And by the time I backed more and more towards the front door where we came in, he had shot the man. And then I don't know if the gun jammed or whatever, but they were at a distance. But he threw it down, and they had a knife too, and they began to attack the woman until she stopped moving, and then everything just got silent. And they went toward the back of the house, and I left. I ran. After I ran out of the house, I ran to the end of the street where we had threw our bikes in an empty lot. And by the time I pulled my bike out of the bushes where they were, out from the snag of all the other bikes, I saw them already coming up the street. My first thought was to go back to Bobby's house, who lived not too far from there. So going around the corner, I ran into the 16-year-old Chris, and he had stopped me. And he had seen in my face how I was freaked out. Like, I was in panic, and I couldn't even talk. And he was asking me what happened. And by that time, the two, Alvin and Bobby, came back around the corner, and they caught up the group of us. And he asked me where I was going, no one's going home. We're all going here. We're all going to Bobby's house. And then we're going to go to someone else's house. And everything else is kind of like a daze. But we went to Bobby's house. He did some stuff to, I guess, clean up and hide his gun. And he took us to another guy's house, which was about a mile away near Hudson Beach there. And he began to boast and brag about what he had did. And he had presented evidence, told him I told you I could do this. And he presented evidence, and he had actually severed the man's finger off to show him that he did this. And there was another kid in that room when he's describing all this. And thank God for that, because he was courageous enough to tell his older brother about what he had saw and heard. So his brother, who lived in the neighborhood, went and checked the house out and saw there was smoke coming out of it. I guess they had tried to set it on fire, and he called the fire department and police. And of course they discovered the bodies. So this happened. It was before 10 o'clock at night. By 6 o'clock next morning, Alvin and I made us all go back to his house, which was, some 5-6 miles away. And they had the house surrounded. They were calling us while we were inside and telling us to come out with our hands up. Alvin had found a way to hide somehow in the attic under the insulation, but I came out willingly, and I felt like I was rescued. Getting into a police car, I felt like finally this is over, because and Little did I know, the nightmare was just beginning too. So they began to question us right there, but then they realized that our age would kind of preclude that, I guess. So they had to take us into the station and call our parents and have our parents present when they questioned us. So that's kind of how the day progressed.
It amazes me. I mean, because we're not talking about a trigger went off. We're talking about a gruesome murder.
Yeah.
I mean, it was in cold blood. Not only do they shoot the gentleman, but they stab the woman. He's bragging about it and cuts a finger off.
Yeah.
What kind of guy was Alvin before this all happened?
I knew of Alvin for a while before I'd actually met him. I met him probably some 6 months before this. And this is interesting. When he was still driving, he had dropped me off at home one time, and my mother saw him once. And my mother's not a spiritual person. She's not anything like that. She saw him once, and she told me, Tim, I do not want you to ever hang out with that kid ever again. This is about 2 months before this happened. And this is something later on as after getting saved and learning the things of the Word of God, and I realizing that one of the first principles, first commandment with promise in the 10 Commandments is that honor thy mother and thy father, thou shalt live long in the land. And it's I couldn't even see it then, because like I can hear my mother saying it, and I can imagine what I was thinking, and that you don't know him, or I know who my friends are, that kind of thinking, as just not a rebellious teen, but someone that's not set up to receive what she's actually imparting me, which would be the protection of God, just staying away from that guy.
That speaks to a lot of there's youth there, of course, Raul, you alluded to it, assessing your friends and assessing the people you're around. What you described, it sounds like a nightmare, but I know that a lot of individuals can relate to that. I was just going to the store with this person. I was just going along. I was just going to be there. My role wasn't going to be significant, and it turned drastically in just a few moments.
Yeah, before I knew it, it seemed like I was stuck in a dream, like one of those long hallways that you just can't run fast enough to get down. It seemed everything was in slow motion, and yeah, I was completely overwhelmed. Like from the moment after getting in the door, the first time I heard someone else's voice, and everything else just kind of stopped.
I know what that's like as an adult, but you were, correct me if I'm wrong, 14 at the time.
Yeah.
And there's parents that are involved, and there's, of course, this isn't just like, taking candy from the candy store,
Yeah,
or anything. This is first degree double murder. What's going on with you emotionally, physically?
So initially getting arrested, I felt like I was getting saved. I wasn't around this guy anymore. I immediately tried to tell the people what I saw, answering the questions. But I do remember kind of feeling shame. Like, so I know there was things I was leaving out because it made me feel like I was guilty too. Like, I went with these guys to this place. I saw this happen, and I'm in a room where this happened. How could that be? Even though I didn't realize it could have happened. Like, I couldn't see the possibility of this happening. I couldn't play that out in my mind, play the situation out like forward enough to realize that this is a potential possibility. But once it did, I knew shame. I knew guilt. I knew when my parents saw me for the first time after they came into the police station and they looked at me, that I felt bad. Like, then I didn't know God how to reconcile that, but I know my mother didn't look at me the same. I know she wanted to hug me, but she couldn't. That wasn't really even an option. So that's kind of how going into through the rest of that time before I had an experience with God, that I felt, like completely isolated.
Tim, in my case, my brother and I, we were a high-profile things. We were in the papers and the news. I can imagine, because of the nature of the crime, this was all over the place.
It was.
And I remember the shame and the pain that my parents went through, even though I was a 34-year-old man at the time, because of the media and everything. Did you ever talk to your mom and dad about what they were going through?
Not till I was much older. I think I did broach the scenario with my mom that what if I'd have came home? What if I'd have came home and I told you what happened? And this is obviously 10, 12 years after the event. Well, she died actually 10, 12 years, but it was 8, 10 years after the event that she said, if you'd have came home, I'd have took you straight to the airport. Like that's probably looking with parental hindsight, realizing she just wants to protect me from what I went through from that point. But I don't know, because I was such a kid. I think I was oblivious to how it really could affect everyone else around me. I was so caught up in my mess, I couldn't see outside of that. I don't think until my sentencing day is when I started realizing it wasn't about me. They were crying, I wasn't crying, because I felt guilty, and I knew the potential, what if I was convicted, this was going to be the sentence. But I don't think my parents and my grandmother was expecting that. So feeling their grief hurt me more than what the judge had just sentenced me to.
I briefly bring that up because we talked to a lot of you guys who are doing time now or whatever, but I think that's a very important point, how family members, mothers, fathers, sisters, kids suffer. And sometimes we don't recognize the circumstances that we put them in. My mom said one thing before she passed away, and she says, we've done the time with you. So I just thought I'd bring that up. When you have visitation this weekend or coming up next month or whatever, a little bit more compassion for mom and dad, sisters, siblings, whatever. This is what it's all about. Because, Tim, you're a different person now, and thank you for sharing that.
There was some piece you mentioned that at the Satan that you were able to almost have not like an out-of-body experience, but your experience wasn't theirs. Was there an encounter with God at any time from the time that you were arrested to the time that you were sentenced?
So after going into the county jail, one of the first non-blur light, or going into the juvenile detention center, which I stayed at for 9 days before being adjudicated as an adult, to where they sent me to the county jail to wait trial. Rusty Holbrook, the man I mentioned before, he came and visited me. And I now realize that being a man filled with the Holy Spirit, speaking what God has to speak for me, he was the first person that made the blur go away for a minute. He was the first person that I could actually hear speaking to me about this. And even though I didn't get saved in that moment, it was a seed that was planted, that that the things he spoke to me over right there, it set me in a place to know that I can look for something, because I didn't know God. I didn't know of God. I didn't know any which way to look in God. It was about 1.5 years after being in the county jail that you get so fed up with seeing the same walls, hearing the same noises, that anytime they call anything to get out of the pod, you go. I was in there for almost 2.5 years awaiting trial. And those were the hardest 2.5 years I did in all my time. But they called a Bible study. I just wanted to go. I just signed up, and just to get out of the pod. And I found myself sitting in this room with a few other guys, a couple other guys, and it was a little old ex-biker who had tattoos, and he was grizzled looking, had a grizzled beard, but he just had that gnarly biker appearance. And he's sharing about the love of Jesus. And the first thing that comes to mind is why would you come talk to us? But I knew it, immediately once I asked the question, I heard from God. I could feel the love of God through him. And I related it back to Rusty. Why would Rusty come and take his time to speak things of God to me? Why would he take out of his schedule to come see a guy who was getting charged with murder? And I felt dirty, but he made it a point to come see me and hug me and tell me about things God, even though I didn't understand what he said. And I'm seeing it again in someone, a complete stranger. This love of God that's coming through this guy, and he's talking about Jesus. His theology wasn't sound. He did tell how God had delivered him from his addictions, the abuse that he had been through, and it was that he was inflicting on others as he got older, and how that God had changed him, and it was all through Jesus. And he says, you need to know about Jesus. And he made sure we all had Bibles when we left that day. And he said, if you ever have questions about this man, or if you want to see it for yourself, you could start in Matthew, and you could read his story yourself. And God set up a circumstance that wasn't a month or two later, that I found myself going into a confinement cell for 45 days. I didn't do anything wrong. It was a complete setup on how God just wanted to get me by myself for this time. And immediately I found that the walls were closing in on me. I'm 15 years old now. My lawyer's been telling me how the legal system works and how that they can actually convict me. So the illusion of possibly going home is gone. the guilt I'm feeling is becoming more substantial. And that word that he had spoke about this man, Jesus, I look at my bin. That's all I had to read. And I had no other distractions, no view to look out, no one to talk to on the bars.
I hate to interrupt, Tim. We want to hear the rest of that part of the story, but I see it as being great material for our coming episode. I would really like to know, where is Alvin and Bobby? Because we're hearing what happened to you. Where are they at? What's going on now with them?
So as far as I know, Alvin is still on death row at Florida State Prison or Union. I think it's Union Correctional. Bobby was sentenced to 2 life sentences running consecutively. So he has a 50-year mandatory.
We've been following your life from the time that you were in Chicago to the time that you were in Hudson, Florida, to this crime that was committed, to the arrest. And now we're kind of going to go into the prison sentence, but we don't want to do that without first backtracking, because I heard you say 2 things that stuck out in my mind. And I want you to give the viewers who are listening or viewing us by their tablets in prisons all over the United States and some by satellite all over the world. You mentioned something about when the man of God came in to speak to you, and everything around you was blurry, but then there was what I heard, clarity. There are some people right now that are needing that clarity from God, right where they are in their situation. And you can speak to anything that you've learned throughout this journey that you were talking about that you could share with them. What would it be?
As I was testifying to like what that experience was like for me, I just remember how dark everything appeared, and to hear Rusty talk about a God that loved me despite of what I've already been part of, that I didn't even know. I saw a glimmer of light. I didn't understand it, but I saw light in the midst of all that darkness. When I saw the volunteer at the county jail talking about this man, Jesus, that changed his life, and I'm asking myself, why is he even sitting here talking to us? Why would he waste his time on us? And he's talking about this Jesus, and he made it a point to give us that Bible and tell us if we wanted to look, he's there. I saw the light a little clearer. When I found myself at my darkest moment, when I'm realizing that this sentence more than likely it's going to be carried out, and I don't even know what life was before. Like, I didn't have a life yet. I was still a kid, and they're telling me they're going to take my life. When I opened that Bible and saw what God presented in him, in eternal life, that light blew everything out of the water. If I had to spend the rest of my life in prison, even now, after doing 25 years, if I had to go another 25, 50 years in prison, he's worth it. He was worth it. Knowing that light, that day star that shines in our hearts because of the word of God being made manifest in Jesus.
You have been listening to the Death or Prison podcast, brought to you by leanonmeusa.org. I am Johnny Bradham. To my right, Mr. Raul Lopez. You've been listening to the first part of a phenomenal testimony. Timothy, thank you. But you have to tune in for the next episode to hear the rest of the story, because there is more to the story. So this is the Death or Prison podcast, but we always say,
choose life.